Okay, Helen, it's all yours. I'll allow you to introduce yourself as well, if you'd like to say a little bit about yourself, please.
Okay. Well, I don't actually live in Faringdon. I live in Highworth, and I've been going to the Faringdon Peace Group for quite some years. I'm also part of Extinction Rebellion, and a friend and I went up to COP 26. But we were only able to go up for a few days, so it's a bit of a personal overview that I've got, partly from the people that we spoke to there, and from what I've read and various other bits and pieces, together with some a bit of an overview. So, but I'm no expert on anything, and I'd be very pleased if you can fill in. If people have picked up other stuff, I think it would be very helpful to chip in when you want to. Just as a little refresher, the government had this 4-point plan going into it, to keep within 1.5 degrees, to make sure that they kept that as a possibility, because we're very close to that now. We're about 1.2, 1.3 possibly even degrees, and there's natural variability, of course, in the climate, so we're very close to that 1.5 degrees. So that was their first target. The second one was adaptation to protect communities and local habitats. So, a bit of a recognition about the, Earth's natural ecology and ecosystem. The third one was to mobilise finance. So to try and get money to move between investing in fossil fuels and move it over to renewables. And there's supposed to be, this 100 million given each year, 100 billion each year to developing nations and the nations that are going to be most severely affected, to adapt and to help them move towards a safer, more secure position, and to work together to deliver all these things, which is a bit of a vague target, but that's what it was. Just to, see, these are 2 degrees C. We need to be on this line, this sort of yellowy one, the second one up from the bottom. So you need to be looking at, temperatures about 1.7, and certainly no more than that, to keep it consistently, again, because of the natural variability within the climate and various sort of weather systems. And to keep below 1.5, you need to be right down on the green line. Well, of course, we're absolutely nowhere near that at the moment. So that's where we went into it. And this is this little link. I don't know if you can show that little link, can you, Sherd? But never mind if you can't. I'll leave that one then. So the government, just prior to COP26, various governments were coming out with new NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. This is obviously to make things look good for COP. And they came out, instead of just the 0 degrees by 2050, they came out with reducing it by 68% by 2030 and by 78% by 2035. So effectively, as we saw on the first graph, it's at where you start and reduce those, where your climate is going to end up. So by reducing these new targets, then they're effectively steepening that curve down to 0. And many other governments produce similarly tight targets. Was India came out and said they were looking at 2070 because they're very coal-based, and I think China was 2060 for their 0 carbon. But it's something. So the key findings of Chatham House after COP was that the gap has narrowed by about 15% from where we were prior to COP and to where we need to be. But we're still not there. And so for the estimated rise, if every nation follows everything that they should do according to what they have promised, then we're still looking at a 2.4 degree rise by the end of the century. And, you know, that's very optimistic to assume that they would actually do that. There's also a 44% chance of reaching 1.5 degrees in the next 5 years. There was only a 22% chance last year. So that gives an indication of how quickly the risk is increasing. For each year we continue producing emissions.
Yep.
You know, initially at COVID, some people were saying, oh, at least, you know, that's one thing that we should see a drop in emissions. And yes, there was a drop, but it hasn't been maintained. And post-COVID, it's more than caught up, and we're seeing an increase in emissions. And there's been a phenomenal rise in emissions over the last few years. So even though there was all that shutting down and you know, loss of production during COVID, you know, the worst, you know, initially, it hasn't significantly reduced, which is another indicator really of what we need to be looking at in terms of getting to be where we need to be. So the good stuff that came out from it was that 1.5 degrees is still within reach, but Alok Sharma said in his closing speech, it barely has a pulse. So it's very quickly disappearing out of reach. It recognizes the gulf between countries. Oh, bugger. Sorry. Right.
Helen, if you very carefully take the plus, can you see the plus and minus slider bottom right? You could try carefully doing the plus a few times, or just slide it slightly, but without, go ahead, that's better.
Oh,
yeah,
that's slightly better, yes.
Now we can read it. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Right. So.
No, yes, I'm on the screen now. But just let me know whether I'm going to do 11 o'clock marks. Probably in an hour's time. Okay.
Sorry, was that a question?
Sorry, Reggie, could you mute yourself, please?
Could I what?
Could you mute yourself, please? Mute. Mute yourself. Bottom left, click your microphone.
Oh, right, yeah.
Mute it, that's it. Sorry, Helen, all yours.
Okay, right. So it recognises the gulf between where countries need to be and where they actually are, which is the first time really that they seem to have recognised that. So at least that's you know, that's a positive thing. And it finalised the key elements of the 2015 Paris Agreement, and particularly this Article 6, which is the carbon credits. So via this UNFCCC mechanism, and that seems to be very beneficial. But how that will work in practice and how these carbon credits will be, as it were, accredited, I don't know. I think that perhaps is something that we'll have to see. Apparently, it has increased trust between countries. This is what he said. That obviously has to be a positive on any measure. They've also agreed to come back each year. So there's going to be an annual round table to consider progress and to report to a leaders summit in 2023. So hopefully they'll all come back in 2023 and see where they're not meeting their targets or what more needs to be done, and come out with better targets. Particularly we need the developing nations, you know, like China and India, to try and move to a more fossil fuel free economy. It was the first time that nations have listened to the public, allegedly, and the most vulnerable nations, and that they've actually agreed that fossil fuels will have to be phased out at some stage. That seemed to be extraordinary that they hadn't actually recognised that previously. But anyway, they mustn't have done. So the adaptation fund, so support is going to be doubled by 2025. So instead of the 100 billion, it's going to be 200 billion. Since the leadership by the UK and by Italy, so over the last sort of couple of years, because they when they got the leadership in 2019, apparently in 2019 there was only about 30% of the world had zero net carbon, and now that's 90% and some 80% of emissions. I think there's about, you know, there's all these figures and percentages keep floating around, but it's very difficult to see, you know, how valid they are and what they're actually counting. So I don't know, for instance, if this 80% of emissions includes military emissions. There didn't seem to be any information about that. That should be 90% of forests are covered by a pledge now to end deforestation by 2030. So that's good, but you know, it's still quite a long way away. So it depends on what happens between now and 2030, whether, for instance, the Amazon will have passed its tipping point. And there's going to be an end to international coal subsidies. China particularly have been financing coal mines in other places, you know, internationally, particularly in Africa, I think. And so that's going to stop, but they haven't stopped with the oil or gas. So the not so good stuff. Mia Mottley, who's the president of Barbados, you know, came out and said that 2 degrees is a death sentence for their country, and you know, for a lot of the other smaller island nations. But then you have people like Putin who's saying that 2 degrees wouldn't be so bad for the Russians, because it would make, you know, parts of their landmass more accessible. Neither he nor Xi Jinping came to COP, although you know, the Chinese you know, sent very good negotiators, and I'm sure they came from Russia as well, but they didn't come in person for various reasons. I think the accounting methods, we were talking to some scientists, and the accounting methods were mentioned repeatedly about how these accounting methods are verified for the emissions. The military still don't seem to be included, which is a huge problem if you're looking at you know, the US emissions, and methods of reduction. Seems to be a lot of emphasis on nuclear. They're still talking about zero emission cars by 2040, but 2035 in Western markets, which is good. But there's, you know, we're still looking at individual cars rather than a, you know, real push towards public transport. Emissions need to fall by about 15% a year to stay within the 1.5 degrees C, which is a phenomenal amount, actually. And I mean, there's questions around, you know, whether was the voice of smaller nations heard? Do they have actually a big place at the table, or in fact any place? There are about 500 fossil fuel lobbyists there, which was the largest delegation. And the voice of young people, you know, was that heard? Because obviously they're going to be the most affected. So other things that's worrying this is, you know, that the lots of tipping points are unknown, but we know that they are very close. So it's a high risk strategy, allowing the temperature to rise to any significant amounts. For instance, with the Amazon flipping to a savanna, it's lost about 17% of its area at the moment, and it's thought that the tipping point is about 20%. So, you know, that's not very far away. You've got metal hydrates. As the temperature of the sea level rises, those metal hydrates release huge amounts of carbon dioxide. Obviously, as the temperature rises, you're more likely to lose the Greenland and the Antarctic ice sheets. They've all seem to be already starting to become unstable. And the permafrost as well, that will really release huge amounts of carbon into the atmosphere. But we don't know where those tipping points are, and any one of them could tip into irrecoverable climate change and overheating.
Did you ever ask him why he was so intent on that? He said it was a duty. He said it was a duty.
So I thought this was quite interesting. This is COP21. This is COP26. There's been barely a blip. So that's rather disappointing. So let's hope this one is going to be a lot more successful. I thought interesting at this point, which you probably, that's the war. That's 1940 to 1945. So I thought it was interesting that it there was a significant blip in the actual climate during that period. On the ground, we went up on the Friday. We came back on the Tuesday, so we really only had 3 full days there. There were lots of activists, which was good to see from all over the place, from lots of different countries. The police were incredibly relaxed. There were hardly any police anywhere, which was extraordinary, really. If anybody's been up to any of the big London demonstrations where there's just, you know, hundreds of police all over the place, and they were extremely friendly, but they were very hands-off completely, apart from 1 or 2 incidents. You know, minority groups and indigenous people seem to be disadvantaged throughout, really, apart from, you know, from costs, apart from anything else, because the costs of accommodation were absolutely phenomenal. And you probably heard that a group of people had taken over an abandoned building that had been used by the council as temporary accommodation. And they put up a load of indigenous elders into this building, and they were repeatedly harassed by the police. Apparently, I don't know if anybody saw on the news, but the police were actually taken to task over that. You know, that these people should not have been. And there was actually, they actually showed a video where they'd been picked up on camera as breaking into this building. And saying that, but the story they put out was actually that they were going in to make sure that it was safe, but they'd actually broken in themselves. We spoke to one of the young organisers of the youth march on the Friday, and the young people only actually received 4 tickets to go into COP. And you think there were 500 oil lobbyists, fossil fuel lobbyists, but the young people only got 4 tickets. There were very good side events, films, and lots of different actions by lots of different groups. The march on Saturday the 6th, which was the Global Day of Action, and there were marches all over the world really for that, all over the country as well. That was hugely diverse, from people from all sorts of places, and there was a lot of support from local people. So, but where do we go from here? We're seeing in sort of increasingly authoritarian stance by lots of governments against protesters. And I'm sure you've probably seen this morning that extra bits have been added to the PCSC bill, which makes it an offence to actually glue yourself on or lock yourself on to something. And the sentence will be 51 weeks. There's been a virtual news blackout of some issues, for example, the hunger strikers from the Insulate Britain. Seen very little about that on the news. And within days of COP ending and all these wonderful pledges, Biden approved over 2,000 new oil and gas explorations, and the same by the UK government and the Cumbrian coal mine. And also the UK government pledged, I don't know, was it something like 40 billion to develop oil reserves in the Congo. So I think it leaves a bit of a question of where we are and how much commitment has actually been made by governments. So I'm sure you'll all have lots to comment on from your own views. So I'll hand back to Sherd now.
Thank you very much, Helen. We got there, didn't we, through the slides?
Yeah, I'm sorry about it.
Oh, no, don't worry at all. No, they were very visible in the end. I will just, or in fact, could you stop sharing now?
Yeah, you share. How do I do that?
Hang on, I might be able to do it. Stop sharing.
Oh, yes, I can see.
There you go.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. And let's just make it that we can see each other. Here you go. Now, thanks ever so much. Oh, we've had a couple new faces who have joined us. So what we'll do now is open discussion. If you could raise your hand, please, either physically or by using the Zoom software. You've got a little hand raising thing along the bottom under reactions. If you want to use that, that's fine as well. I'd like to just briefly start by picking on one person. Richard, could you take yourself off mute?
Yeah, good evening, folks.
Hi, and I'm going to pick on you because I just happen to know that you have spent your career in oil and gas exploration, or at least a part of it, and maybe you could comment on Helen's observation in her last slide about what's going to happen now in terms of this exploration in the North Sea. You might know a little bit more about it than we do.
Yeah, okay. Yes, good evening, everybody. So in the last sort of decade of my career, I was working equally on offshore wind and on oil and gas. And offshore wind was growing, steadily through that period. And my company managed the surveys of the seabed to enable things to be built, whether they were oil and gas or wind farms. Now, what is interesting, and I had a meeting even today, I'm doing little bits of consultancy still, and for the big seismic companies are really seeing the turn in the industry. They want to get into how can they work for carbon capture and storage, how can they work for offshore wind, and the investment money is basically leaving the oil and gas patch really quickly. So I think a bit like what Mark Carney was saying during COP, follow the money. The money is leaving oil and gas very quickly, and it's going to be very difficult to get stuff sanctioned that's got any kind of long-term life, viewed. So a lot of the industry, a lot of the organizations in oil and gas are really trying to find their new careers and new sort of futures in the clean technology. So I think that is a positive, I would say, that we can take from this. As far as the investment bit goes, the Cambo oil field has become the kind of poster child of what can be stopped, and it is it's a good new big thing that acts as a sort of a figurehead of the commitment. And it was interesting. Nicola Sturgeon, I think, has finally come out and decided it shouldn't go ahead from her perspective. So, but there are all sorts of little minor developments, which, as you say, in terms of keeping our petrol cars filled with petrol for the next 5 years, are we going to need that sort of stuff? And I think there is some argument about, we should be doing it locally under better HSE conditions, but it's the symbology of saying we're still investing when we're supposed to be backing off and not investing, which is, and again, which is the big message we should be getting across. So yeah, the industry is, it's like a big super tanker trying to turn it around, but it is, there is a heck of a lot of realization and effort going into changing course for the energy industry. People are, companies are changing their names to energy companies to not be oil and gas companies. So yeah, things are happening quite fast, I would say, and the money is moving, which is the encouraging part.
Okay, thanks very much, Richard. And I'm also going to pick Reggie. Could you come off mute, please? Come off mute. And are you in Gibraltar at the moment?
No, I'm here in England.
You're here, right? Okay. Okay. I'd like your take. I should just briefly explain that Reggie is also an Extinction Rebellion campaigner and has been arrested a number of times. And in fact, at the moment, the court case that's going through. Do you want to say a little bit about that, please?
Well, the court case going through is of three friends of mine who have been with Extinction Rebellion, and two of them they've also done the Insulate, and both cases are going through this week. One of them, Ruth Jarman, who was a great friend of mine, in fact is involved in both cases. The first one was when she climbed on top of a train with Phil Kingston, and she'll be tried on that. And I think that the other one is she was insulating in London on M25 with a Church of England lady called Sue Parfitt, who was been actually tried on another charge and dismissed a few months ago. So they're doing that, and they're going to continue doing things. Of course, the whole idea of Insulate and Extinction Rebellion originally was really that the only way you could get governments to do things is if you really brought them to a standstill in some way. And what we all really hoped would happen was that thousands of people would be arrested to the extent that, in fact, the government would be forced to do things. My own feeling is that the government hasn't paid, the Extinction Rebellion and Insulate have got a lot of people knowing now what is going on, but I don't think the government has changed in any way at all. So that's not particularly good. This COP26, the one thing that was really missing was an example by Boris Johnson of what he was prepared to do, because we're talking about the survival of mankind really here. And if we were, this was a question of a war, all stops would come out and we would all be forced to do various things that we didn't want to do, and we would do it for the sake of the nation and all the rest of it. The world, 85% of the G20 are 85%, those countries in the G20 are the ones who produce 85% of the emissions in the world. And yet those are the ones that are finding it difficult to take the steps that are needed in order to reduce emissions so that we stay within the 1.5 degrees centigrade. In fact, of the first 100 billion that they said they were going to do, they've only produced 80 billion so far. And the rest is not going to be produced, I think, till 2023. So we need to really think how to tackle what needs to be done now in a way that is going to persuade the governments to do what they need to be done. And I don't know really what that would entail, but I think all of us has got to think deeply about that and come up with some ideas that can be discussed and argued about to see whether there's any way of doing it, because basically, COP26 did a few things, but it basically failed in what it was supposed to do. And now we have, I think, one more chance of doing this. Perhaps you noticed that before COP26, they were saying that we needed to reduce the emissions by 7.5% a year. Now they're saying 15% a year. And if we'd gone back 20 years, they were only saying 2.5%. And 7.5% was hard enough, but 15% is really a tremendous amount. We need to be on a war footing. That's what it comes to. And not merely this nation, but all nations, really, in order to pull this up, get the things round so that in 2027 and COP27, in COP27, we actually managed to put through what really is required. And we haven't got long to do it. And we have to think out, what things we might be able to do.
Okay. Thank you, Reggie. Normally, we don't ask people's ages, but can you just remind us, how old is Ruth that you spoke about, who's being arrested?
What?
How old is Ruth?
Ruth is in her 50s.
Oh, sorry, Phil.
Sue Parfitt is in her 70s.
All right. And Phil?
Phil is about 84.
Okay. So
slightly younger than me.
Well done. And I am just going to add one other piece of information to, you mentioned that they've only reached 80 billion on the adaptation fund, but actually I think the worst bit about all of that is that 70% of that is in loans. It is not in gifts. So in fact, these are soft loans. So it's absolutely awful that, and in fact, Narendra Modi at COP26, he came out and said, we don't need 100 billion per year. We need 1 trillion per year, he said. And that is a realistic amount to really change things. So it's fascinating, isn't it, that we've set ourselves this target of 200 billion by 2025, but actually someone like Narendra Modi is saying it's got to be 1 trillion per year, and it's not loans, it's actually got to be the rich countries genuinely, as you say, a war footing, putting their money where their mouth is for all the damage that's been done over the last 200 years.
And of course, we know because we were told by the American representative, whose name I forget now, at COP26, that in the last about 3 or 4 years, the rich nations of the world have given $3 trillion worth in subsidies. I mean, that is a horrendous picture. I mean, it shows you how the whole thing is completely balanced in the wrong direction.
Okay. So it's open floor. Anyone who wants to ask questions or raise points or share observations, thoughts, it's all yours. Kate.
Hi, everybody. Lovely to meet all of you. And thank you very much to Faringdon Peace Group for putting this on, and to Helen for stepping in at the last minute. I'm Kate Aldridge from 0 Hour Oxfordshire, which is the Oxfordshire campaign in support of the CEE bill, the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which is a national campaign. I'm just wondering, actually, how many of you are familiar with the bill? I don't suppose you'd raise your hands if you've heard of it. So no. Only a couple of people, which is interesting. Just sort of really following on from what Reggie was saying about, what can we do? What steps should we take now, because we need to do something. We know from COP and pre-COP that there were lots of very ambitious pledges that were set, lots of very ambitious targets that were set. But the problem is, consistently at every COP, consistently from the beginning, there's been no improvement in terms of the parts per million of carbon that's been put into the atmosphere. And the problem is that all these targets are pledged, and then sufficient action isn't taken. So what the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill is a piece of legislation that's going through Westminster at the moment. It was presented to Westminster in September 2020, and it now has the support of 150 parliamentarians across all political parties, so across the Lords and the Commons. We don't yet have support from any Conservative MPs, but we are engaging actively with all political parties. we've got the support now of over 100 councils across the country. And in Oxfordshire, we've got the support of, I think, 19 councils now, including Oxfordshire County Council, Oxford City Council, South Ox, Faringdon, I understand, have recently passed a motion to support the bill. And so what we as a regional group are doing is we're trying to engage with communities to work with us, because we're only a small group of about 4 or 5 active volunteers, to work with us to secure the support of businesses, councils, ranging from up from parish level, all councils. So businesses, councils and schools. We've just recently launched a schools campaign, and we're very keen to bring schools on board to pledge their support for this campaign, to make it very clear to all of the Oxfordshire MPs that we need them to back this bill. So far, out of the 6 Oxfordshire MPs, we only have Leila Moran supporting, and we really need to build the pressure. I'm conscious that other people will want to speak, but if I could just quickly say before I finish that, because you might be wondering what the bill does. So just very briefly, it commits the UK to the carbon budget for 1.5, because we keep talking about 1.5, but as Helen so eloquently pointed out, a lot of things that we're doing are pulling in completely the opposite direction. The coal mines, the licenses for the oil extraction and so on. The second thing it does is it creates a joint emergency strategy for climate and nature. So it really treats the climate and ecological crises as 2 sides of the same coin. And I've heard a lot of people talking about COP27, but we need to remember that COP15 is critically important, and that's going to be held, I think it's next July. Sorry, I just need to ask my partner to get my lead because I'm just about to run out of battery. The third thing it does is it establishes, takes account of the UK's global consumption-based emissions, because at the moment we don't account for shipping, aviation and accounting for overseas manufacture, because what we've done is we've outsourced so much manufacture to China, but we don't count that in our territorial emissions. So that's absolutely critical, and we need to have transparency so that we can look at our supply chains. And so, you know, consumers can know what we're buying when we go to the supermarket. And the fourth thing it does is it establishes a climate and nature assembly, because we know that politicians cannot take the necessary action because of the short-term nature of the system that we have. They can never be brave enough to make the right decisions, and they're nervous about making the right decisions. We know that citizens' assemblies do work. They have a track history of working if they are implemented correctly, and that means that they need to have proper publicity surrounding them. And it can be a great engagement tool to engage with the public, to help to educate the public about the severity of the crisis. And in fact, at COP26, you might have seen that there was a global citizens' assembly that was given the floor there, that I think was very well received and was strongly supported by Alok Sharma. So those are the things the bill does. We would love you to support. I'll pop the link to our website in the chat. And if anybody does want to get in touch, I'll put the address for our campaign in there as well. And also we need volunteers, because we're only about 4 people who are active, and we just desperately need more people. So if you're interested in getting involved, if you want to do something, we're gaining loads of traction, but we need more people to help. So thanks very much.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Well, it's a very good answer to Reggie's point, saying we all need to now start taking things seriously and taking action. And Kate, you've outlined something that we really can genuinely make a difference on. So thank you very much for that.
I have actually asked David Martin to support that bill, but he obviously hasn't.
Yeah. No. Anyway, thank you. I don't know if anyone's seen Richard's questions in the chat. Does anyone know how the objective scope of COP27 compares to the Leaders Summit in 2023? Anyone, any comments on that?
What did you say? What is it?
If you look at the chat on the right, yeah. Reggie, you need to open up your little chat box. Then you can see that. Dave, bye. Thanks. Gone. Richard has asked, does anyone know how the objective and scope of COP27 in Cairo compares to the Leaders Summit in 2023?
Yeah.
So in other words,
I don't know.
so the Leaders Summit is this commitment to meet every year, whereas COP27 is simply, the annual. So COP meets every year, and then every 5 years it's the big one. So the last big one was COP21 in Paris, and so on. So that's the pattern of it. So COP27. Does anyone know the answer? How does the Leaders Summit fit in with COP27? No, not to worry.
Yeah, what I think they've decided is that they've got to get rid of this 5-year one, because that is allowed under the Paris Agreement. And really the only way we're going to overcome this is if we are only allowed to measure what people have done every year. And that is the only way we can bring pressure to bear on these meetings to get things really done.
Yeah, okay. Anyone else who wants to comment or raise their hand, wants to join in the discussion? Nigel, you're still on mute.
Thank you. I think, yeah, I'm unmuted. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Helen. That was a very interesting and last minute, what a good talk. That's wonderful. I just wanted to clarify the question about the military issue. And the military figures haven't been included ever, and are not included by prior agreements in all of these discussions. And this is a huge element of the use of fossil fuels. So for example, the United States military is the biggest single user in the world of fossil fuels. So that just shows you the extent of this hidden element. They use an enormous amount of fossil fuels. I have no idea how much the UK military forces are, but if you can see that stretched across the planet, then there's a huge amount of fossil fuel usage, which is never going to be included in the discussions. That is something that we must campaign on. We do have XR rebellion peace, so XR peace. So this is a fusion really of the peace movement and of the XR movement, because it needs to focus on the military aspects that are often hidden. So that's also going on at the same time as all the other amazing things that are happening with XR. And the latest C&D campaign is Trident, climate, not Trident. So you can see that in the range of the posters and things we had in the marches recently, and that will be continued, I guess, into the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Nigel. Marie.
Oh, sorry, I'm on. Yeah, thank you. If David Johnston had been here tonight, I had a question ready to ask him. And what I wanted to ask, I think, there's a lot of attention given to reducing, fossil fuel usage, reducing carbon emissions and so on. But not very many people seem to be looking at the things that economically we need to do in order to get those emissions and in order to get, the back to the safe limits that we're looking for. And I don't hear many people addressing the issue that our economic system in the West is based on constant exponential growth. If there's a lack of growth for 2 consecutive quarters, then that's defined as a slump, and that's defined as bad for the economy. People's jobs are under threat and so on. So, as far back as the 1970s, the Club of Rome was talking about the fact that we live on a limited planet. There are limits to growth, and we can't just have continual economic expansion, and that we have to shift to something, some people have called it a steady state economy, a balanced economy, whatever you want to call it. I just wonder, for example, how many people here, support that idea? And and how we get governments to actually think about that aspect of it, because we can't continue to grow while we have limited resources on the planet.
Thank you, Marie. And Helen has already given a slight answer, or at least she's also raised the same point in the discussion. But James, and Helen, you're next, but James, or Emma, go ahead.
Sorry. I'm just wondering, because I think Helen was going to reply to that point, were you not?
Go ahead then, Helen.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, I completely agree with Marie that I think what came across to me clearly is that the COP system isn't capable of delivering on what is required, and you know, the wrong people basically are inside the fence, and the people where change will really happen is outside the fence. But how we achieve that, and I think you know, you link this with the PCSC bill, which is also becoming extremely draconian. How do ordinary people like us actually make those changes? Because we live in a system which is based on fossil fuels, and we don't individually have the power, and we are increasingly losing the power to act as a unit and to make you know, real change. I think this is why I think it's quite a particularly difficult time. I think we're sort of getting into the, I don't know, so that's a bit ridiculous, the sort of end game of where we're actually going with this, because you know, you're getting increasing numbers of people being arrested for instance, Insulate Britain, and yet that is a government policy. So they are asking the government to fulfil their pledges under their manifesto, and they're being arrested and sent to prison for nearly, you know, 12 months for doing it. That's not making any sense. So how do we actually change our lifestyle and make the government make these changes? We're lucky in Britain, we still have a, you know, a level of democracy, but there's, you know, that's why Extinction Rebellion got set up here, because we could all go out on the street, but in the majority of nations people can't. They live in even more repressive regimes than we seem to be moving towards. So
thank you, Helen. James and then Kate.
Yeah, sorry. Given given the way that government's pushing legislation in this particular direction, that is to try and stifle protest or mute it or as much as possible, can I suggest that going forward, that there'd be a bit more discretion about naming individuals and identifying them as such. One of the I'm aware, for instance, of an individual who admittedly has been arrested and so on, but has received hate mail, and I just think that. And bear in mind that you also will have people who are building up a case against individuals and so on. So yes, I think people should protest while they are still able to, and be aware of the consequences of their actions. I mean, sorry, have their eyes open as to how others might see that. But I'm also aware that there's a certain duty of care for support communities to not make their lives any more difficult. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, James. Kate.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to what Marie was saying, and Helen, which I completely agree with, obviously, about the economics point. The government commissioned a review, the Dasgupta review. I think it reported in February 2020, actually. It was quite a long time ago now. So it was Professor Dasgupta from Cambridge University who produced the report, The Economics of Biodiversity, and concluded that we couldn't, we can't, traditional economic models ignore nature as an asset, and we've got to take into account the effect of humans on the biosphere, and we need to change our economic model, and we cannot continue with perpetual growth because it's not sustainable. So that was a Treasury commissioned report that concluded that, and the government gave a very weak response to it several months ago. And I mean, it's obviously very complex, but I think one of the key reasons is that they feel that the public is not ready. We're not ready to change the way we live and to completely overhaul our economic model. And this is why the CEE bill is so important, because what's happening around the country is that councils and businesses and schools are signalling to their MPs that we are ready and that we do recognise that we need to have radical systemic change. But that it needs to happen we need to have a fair transition, and we need to be guided by the public. And that was the other thing I wanted to pick up on, that people were talking about how we can get the government to change, but take the public's view into consideration. And this is exactly what the citizens' assemblies would do. They would be guided by a series of experts, people like Professor Dasgupta, the climate scientists, economic experts, food production experts, and so on. And those experts would be approved by Parliament, and the public would come up with some recommendations that would be put before Parliament for Parliament to debate. So Parliament would remain sovereign, but they would be confronted with well-informed recommendations that were relevant to thinking about this in the long term, rather than just taking short-term solutions. So it's absolutely, in my view, the answer to be considering these really, really important long-term issues and bringing the public's voice into government decision-making.
Thank you, Kate. Reggie.
Well, I entirely agree. And the thing about that would be that when it finally came to Parliament, what people had to do was forget politics. You can't solve this problem on a political basis of parties. You have to solve this by everyone really taking stock, examining their conscience and saying what is best for this country and for the world. And that is the step that really somehow we've got to get to if we're going to get things done. How we do it, I don't know.
Jenny and then Bruce. Jenny, you're on mute.
No, can you hear me now?
Yep.
I think what I would like to say follows on from what the last 3 or 4 or more speakers have said. Obviously, we need a complete sea change in the way we organise ourselves being the nation, Britain and the West, ordinary people. How you get this complete change around is what we're talking about and wrestling with. But I suggest we need to come back to small community groups of people, for instance, raise the issues in our parish councils, district councils, and all organisations, all sorts of different organisations that involve ordinary people. And following on from that, the people who are actually employed in these industries that we want to see changed and developed in other ways depend on the ordinary working people. And it's trying to get through to those groups of people that we need to persuade that we need this change of direction. And the organised working class are organised into unions, and it seems to me we can't make too much progress without involving the trade unions. Those are the people we've got to persuade. A lot of work is being done already on that before, but I think we need to build on it so that we're working from the bottom up, small groups of people, large groups of people, but coming together in our various communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. Bruce.
I've been interested or concerned about pollution for probably more than 30 years. And really, pollution has led to what was original global warming and now climate change. But it's the pollution that's causing both of those. And I was more concerned about what was happening in the ocean and towards animal habitat around the world. I was living in Africa at the time, and it's very, very obvious about what is happening there. The number of species which are going extinct all the time. So it depends what we're protesting against. Are we protesting against just global warming? Is it in the interest of Homo sapiens, in the interest of the planet? If Homo sapiens goes extinct, the planet will probably right itself within a few thousand years, at least a few million years. And the way Homo sapiens is going at the moment, extinction is on the horizon. It's really close. Particularly the loss of habitat concerns me. If you are you're going to have this planet full of people and no other animals. I mean, we have seen a great concern about the loss of bees for doing pollination and all those sort of things. And I think it all comes down to the same basis. And my views are extreme. But if you want to save Homo sapiens and you want to get the temperature back on Earth, back to pre-industrial levels, then you need to get the population of the Earth back to pre-industrial levels. Now that's extreme, but I'm sure eventually that will be the answer. We're under extreme concern. I have great sympathy for people protesting, but if you want to protest, you're much better off going to Tiananmen Square or the White House. What's happening in this country is almost immaterial. It's nice as a feel-good factor, but the percentages of what's going on in this country is very limited. It's extremely worrying. If the figures are right, we're not going to change anything. China's not going to stop. They are totally reliant on coal. The other place, which is extremely concerning, which also still has lots of coal, is Africa. That's where the population in the earth is growing considerably. So, as I say, start reducing the population, start bringing in radical measures to stop the population increasing. And it's extreme, but I believe that's the only way that we are going to solve this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Does anyone want to discuss that in more detail? Reggie, you had your hand up.
Well, I think that the population thing, it's important, but it's not, I think, that important, because if you look at the figures in the developing world, the average person will produce 1 ton of of emissions. Then if you come to Britain, it'd be about 8 tons. America perhaps 10 tons. But then if you get that, which is a huge difference, then and this is a figure I read the other day. If you look at the rich people, and if you're a rich person and you have a yacht, a big yacht, you produce 70 tons. So the rich of the world have got the really rich of the world have got really a big problem if they're going to help us to survive. But between 8 in our country and 1 in the developing world, it's not the developing world that has to reduce the population, really. It's we who have got to reduce our emissions, really.
Bruce, I would answer your question in a very slightly different way. I think you made a very good point, of course, that if the developing world makes the same mistakes as we did, which is what you are implying, meaning Africa has a lot of coal, then of course, absolutely, we're going to hell in a handcart, basically. And yes, you could just about argue in a very negative way that what we then do makes not a jot of difference, kind of thing. Actually, I would always argue, I would say to an individual, however small their contribution is, I would always say, are you part of the problem or are you part of the solution? And that somehow puts them on the spot, because they would really, really like to think that they are part of the solution, even though maybe they won't make a difference. But in terms of your prediction that we are going to hell in a handcart kind of thing, etc., I would suggest that the solution to that, of course, is to make absolutely sure that the development that happens in the developing countries, it happens in a carbon negative or carbon neutral way. And that is why that 100 billion, 200 billion, 1 trillion, i.e. the Narendra Modi figure, is so incredibly important. And we owe it to them to actually come up with the goods. And I would suggest also, that when countries come up with targets that by 2040 they're going to do this, by 2050 they'll do that, and so on, I'm afraid every single time I hear that, what I'm actually hearing is we're kicking this into the long grass for someone else to sort out in the future, and we just want an excuse to do nothing. And what I really, really feel has to be the priority is put your money where your mouth is today, not in 2030, not in 2040, not someone else's problem in the future, but today, and come up with that $1 trillion per year, because that's what we owe the developing countries. So you've made some very good points there, Bruce, but I think also we kind of know what the solutions are. So that would be my answer. Any other comments or contributions to that? It's obviously a very important debate.
Can I come back?
Sorry, Bruce, did you want to come back, or do you want to give Marie a chance first? Go ahead, Marie.
Just one very short point is that I think in most areas of the world, it's been shown that population growth is linked to, economic wealth. So that in countries where people have felt more secure, and poverty is, decreasing, they just automatically have fewer and fewer children, because, in a lot of, I think in a lot of Africa, I think I'm right, having children secures your old age. So I just think it's about sort of equality and justice. If we can help those countries, and we can give them, food that they need, the agriculture that they need, and so on, I think that's one way to bring down population growth.
Thank you very much. Bruce, sorry, you wanted to come back.
I fully agree with your comments and Maria's comments. That's right. But whether we've got that time to happen, what you're suggesting is I fully agree with. But then politicians have got to go to the polls and say to the people, you can expect a lower standard of living for the foreseeable future. You can expect longer waiting periods at the NHS. You can expect lower benefit payments. You can expect poorer schooling, because the money's got to come from somewhere. And we are in the Western world, we're the United States. I can't imagine Biden or Trump going to the population and saying, listen, I'm going to promise you a lesser standard of life, but we are going to improve the standard of life around the world. And you just can't do that in a democratic state, where I believe what's happening, I mean, especially with all these lockdowns and whatever else, we're being trained to be subservient. And we're going to end up with a totalitarian government like China, and they will end up just saying, this is what you will do, and we will save the planet. But trying to do it when you're trying to, I mean, I was listening to Prime Minister's Question Time now, and if you've got that sort of, there is no agreement. There's been no agreement within the United Kingdom about how to deal with COVID. There is no agreement within the EU. While we're fighting with each other, you've got very little chance of sorting out climate change. And it means we have a much, much better standard of living in the Western world than most of the rest of the world. If we were to agree to say, okay, in the UK, we'll agree to have the same sort of income as the average in the world, then you can do then this country can provide that sort of $1 trillion a year to support the developing countries, but it's extremely difficult.
Yeah.
You know,
Bruce,
the answers, I've thought lots and lots about all those things about population decrease,
sure.
but it's a major, major problem.
Bruce,
Thanks.
you have, I'm aware of the time, we've just got a few minutes left, and what you've just said does very much reinforce what we've heard from Helen and Reggie and Marie, that politics, the way that we know it, and you've called it democracy, isn't actually the solution to these problems. It's actually a new way of making decisions which involves people and not politicians. So you've reinforced that point. We just have 2 more minutes, which means one more question. Anyone just want to say something positive about this, about everything that we've been discussing? Helen, you can have the last word if you want. Oh, you're still on mute. Helen, you're still on mute.
Yeah, yes, I think what's become increasingly clear to me is that we have to overlook all the differences and unite with all sorts of different people who perhaps we wouldn't think of uniting with, because we really are in a critical situation. And if we don't unite and find common goals with people, we will not survive. And I think we need to make that clear to the government. I don't know how we do that, because they're fostering division, but we need to do it as people on the ground with each other globally as much as we can. We've got the internet, we can do it. We need to do it.
Thank you, Helen. That was very positive. And Kate, you really are going to have the last word here, so make the most of it.
Thanks. That's very kind. Well, thanks so much, everybody. It's been a really interesting discussion. I just wanted to finish with an ask, really, that if you do want to take some action that is going to have a huge impact, could I please ask you to contact us? Look up 0 Hour Oxfordshire. I have put our details in the chat, but it's 0 Hour Oxfordshire. And what the ask is to contact to work with us to get a CEE bill motion through your parish council. It's not as daunting as it sounds. We have all of the information that you need, and we can guide you through it, but we want to bring on all of the parish councils. So do get in touch. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And there's also a very good discussion going on in the chat line, which will be included in the recording, by the way. So Phil, thanks very much for that link. Also, the documentary about population numbers. It looks as if that's definitely worth watching. So definitely. Oh, sorry. We have run out of time. Jenny, apparently you've got your hand up. Was that?
Just to say that although we didn't have David Johnston here tonight, we have invited him to come in February for our February meeting. I haven't had a reply yet because, as you know, he's only just, we didn't know until about 24 hours ago that he wasn't coming tonight. But there will be, sorry? Well, it'll be the first Wednesday in February if he accepts that invitation. And I think even if he doesn't come in February, that he is keen to come and talk to us. So if we miss him in February, then we'll still keep on and try and get him at some point.
Good, thank you very much. And Helen, thanks again from all of us for stepping into the breach. Thank you.
Thank you for the request.
Right. Thanks, everyone. We will close the meeting, but the recording will be on the Peace Group website, and that will include the discussion, the chat on the right-hand side. All right, thanks, everyone, and have a good evening further. Bye. Bye.
Bye. Bye.